Meeting. You are entering the meeting now.
Hello everyone, good day, and welcome to the Joint Data Centre's second day of the second research conference on forced displacement. My name is Paddy Brock. I'm a senior data scientist at the Joint Data Centre. And Bjorn, are you about to come in?
Yes.
Great.
Hi. Thanks, Paddy. I thought I would just take see if we have a good.
Bjorn, I'm afraid I think you've lost sound. I can't hear you.
Is the sound back?
Yes.
All right, good. Hi, welcome back. Good to see so many participants also on the second day of the research conference on forced displacement. I'm not going to take up a lot of time, but just a couple of minutes, just to one quick reflection from yesterday, that we really had a full range of really high quality interventions from sophisticated microeconomists to policy makers and practitioners, and I would even say decision makers. One thing that is striking is that we do use different languages, and I think it's upon both sides to really make an effort to try to get into each other's heads, if you want, and try to really understand what's being said. And I think it takes an effort on both sides. As someone remarked, you rarely see such a wide range of participants, and I hope that you appreciate that particular aspect of this conference. I personally appreciate how many of the authors of the academic papers have taken the time and effort to really think through the policy implications and even policy recommendations from their findings. I think that's please keep that up. We're well aware that sometimes is hard, but if you don't do it, somebody else will, and you are more in control of what you believe are the big takeaways for a policymaker from your report if you do it yourself. We did hear several of our policy folks talking about being able to access the findings and accessing the reports, accessing in the sense that understanding the language, understanding the points in a context that works for them or is relevant for them. Our contribution from the Joint Data Center to that particular aspect is that we've, since 2.5 years now, we've been summarizing the best literature, academic and report literature on forced displacement, with an emphasis on socioeconomic aspects in half a page a page. So every month, pretty much, we summarize an additional a new set of 10 or 15 papers, and we publish these in a database, and which has a neatly categorized, and what we have found is that what we see is that those kinds of summaries really speak to the programmatic folks and policy makers who want to access academic findings. So I think Agnes has posted that in the chat. Please have a look and see, and please feel free to draw on it as well. I was really pleased to see that one paper, actually, for their introduction, completely relied on that literature review summary that we have. So we are keen to promote your work, and we want to. So please get in touch when you are publishing a paper or you're in the last stages before publication. Do get in touch and let us know, and we will make sure to include it in both our as we disseminate material and as we summarize different research papers. We're also more broadly keen to promote the research agenda on forced displacement, and that can include some advocacy work. And we are launching a little, and I think I mentioned that yesterday. We want to crowdsource what you think are the most important or best examples of where research has really made a difference concretely for those forcibly displaced and their hosts. And I've asked Agnes to post a link to that poll or that survey, and please fill it in. We ask for up to three examples where you see research has made a difference, and we'll come back to that in our last session tomorrow at the end of the conference. Finally, my third point here and third link is the questionnaire that we've asked you to fill in as you register. Please do. It's a really valuable pool of information to draw from for us. So those were the three asks that I had this as we begin. And without further ado, let me hand it back to you, Paddy Brooke, who's a senior data scientist with the Joint Data Center, to kick us off and lead the session on impact of forced displacement. Thank you.
Very many thanks, Bjorn. So this is session 3 on the impact of forced displacement. And so I'm very pleased to introduce our speakers and our 3 papers. Just before we begin, a very brief reminder that we have 20 to 25 minutes per presentation, followed by 5 to 10 minutes for questions after each. Please do post your questions in the chat, even during the talk, so that we can line them up for the speakers for the question session at the end. Those who are listening in via YouTube Live, if you're logged into a YouTube account, you'll also be able to put your questions and comments in the chat there, and we'll bring them into this conversation. Due to some IT issues, we've had a slight rearrangement of the order, and many thanks to our second speaker for agreeing to go first. So I'm going to hand over to Carlo Lombardo to talk about trade creation and skill upgrading effect of Venezuelan forced migration on Colombian manufacturing firms. Carlo, thank you very much, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Paddy. Well, hello, hi to everyone. I am Carlo Lombardo, and I will present the paper that I wrote with Leonardo Piñalosa Pacheco. That is also my master's thesis that I did at the University of La Plata in Buenos Aires, Argentina, where we investigate the effect that the mass migration episodes of the Venezuelan exodus had on the export performance of Colombian manufacturing firms. Firstly, motivated by the fact that forced displacement is an alarming and increasing phenomenon in developing countries, where that host 85% of forcibly displaced people, and further motivated by the fact that Venezuela is the second greatest expeller of citizens in the world, and Colombia is the second greatest host of forcibly displaced people, and motivated by the particular fact of this migration episode that Venezuelans that fled to Colombia are on average more skilled than Colombian nationals, and taking the idea that skilled labor is key to export to developed nations, we explored a new dimension of forced displacement, and investigated if the skilled migrants could allow firms to upgrade their inputs and improve their export performance. For those who are anxious in the room, our main findings we found through an IB strategy that manufacturing firms that operating in Colombian districts that were more exposed to the shock experienced a trade creation effect, which was significant only for firms that already had exporting experience, that was greater for exports to high-income countries of the OECD, both at the intensive and extensive margin, and that was larger for smaller firms. When we wondered about the mechanisms operating behind this trade creation effect, we found that the Venezuelan exodus caused a fall in wages, particularly for blue-collar workers working in exporting firms, and this ease in labor costs allowed firms to skill upgrade their labor inputs and hire workers that were more compatible to exports to high-income countries. On the other hand, we found a noisy effect on employment, as I will tell you later on. So we used 3 sources of data using using our being our unit of observation at the plant level or firm level, and our treatment unit at the department level. Departments are Colombian districts and are similar to United States states. For displaced Venezuelans, we used data from the Colombian Household Survey. We defined Venezuelan migrants as people born in Venezuela, and we only worked with working age people because we analyzed the manufacturing sector. For exports data, we used we used administrative customs data, and we built a balanced panel of exporting plants between 2012 and 2019. And due to the fact that customs data is noisy due to both aggregation and measurement error, we worked with relatively large exporters, plants that exported more than $50,000 each year of our sample. However, on the robustness section, we eased the threshold and all our results remained unchanged. Finally, for the firm's data, we use the annual manufacturing survey, which is a census of every plant with more than 10 employees in Colombia. And we also use the technological development and innovation survey, which asks about educational attainment of the worker working in Colombian companies. So we built two panels. When working with firms' outcomes such as wages and employment, we use a balanced panel of plants between 2012 and 2019. And when working with the skill upgrading part, we use the balanced panel of companies between 2012 and 2019 because the edit only has information at the companies level, but we worked only with single plant companies as to make the second panel comparable with the first panel. For our empirical strategy, we run a fixed effects regression where our outcome variable is at the firm level and our outcomes such as exported value or average wage. Our main variable of interest is the share of displaced persons relative to the 2012 working age population. We use 2012 variables to have data before the exodus, and we run our regressions between 2013 and 2019. We have some departmental controls, which are the real exchange rate, the share of skilled workers, and the departmental GDP per capita for the year 2000 interacted with annual dummies to flexibly control for systematic differences in the departments before the exodus. We also have an interaction term between the pre-shock firm variable, firm variable and annual dummies, where the pre-shock firm variable for the exports analysis are the exports in 2012, and the pre-shock variable for the firms analysis are the sales in 2012, and this allows us to control for pre-existing differences in firms across Colombian departments. And we also finally added firm fixed effects, region year fixed effects, and industry year fixed effects, and we clustered our standard errors at the department year level. And basically what we do here is to compare plants in different Colombian departments with different levels of exposure to the Venezuelan migration. However, as Venezuelans could choose their departments of arrival, and for example, they could go to departments, to more prosperous Colombian departments, and thus this could cause a positive bias in our estimates. We took advantage of the enclave pattern of the Venezuelan migration and built an IB strategy. After a crisis between the Colombian and Venezuelan governments in 2016, borders between both countries were reopened, allowing thousands of Venezuelans to enter into Colombia, and due to the forced nature of their migration, they settled in Colombian departments that are closer to the border with Venezuela. So this enclave pattern allowed us to build an IB strategy where we interacted the stock of Venezuelans living in Colombia in each year with the inverse of the driving distance between each Colombian department and Venezuelan state, weighted with the share of Venezuelans living in each Venezuelan state according to the 1990 census. So this instrument intuitively will predict that there will be more Venezuelans in Colombian states that are closer to Venezuela in Colombian departments that are closer to Venezuelan states with higher historical population density. In all our regressions, our first stage is positive and significant at the 1% level. So, with respect to the results, we found that the Venezuelan exodus had no effect on the probability of exporting. However, when estimating the probability of exporting conditional on having exported in the previous year, we found that a 1 percentage point increase in the share of the Venezuelans relative to the local labor force increased by 0.8 percentage point the probability of exporting. This finding is consistent with the sudden nature of the Venezuelan exodus that only allowed firms that already had exporting experience to take advantage of the migration episode. So from now onwards, we only work with a panel of firms that exported systematically every year of our sample between 2012 and 2019. When analyzing the heterogeneous effect on the probability of exporting, we find that the Venezuelan exodus had a positive effect on the exports to OECD high-income countries and to low-income countries. On the other hand, when analyzing the intensive margin, we found that an increase in 1 percentage point in the share of Venezuelan migrants relative to the departmental labor force increased by 11.2% the exported value of Colombian manufacturing plants. When analyzing the heterogeneous effect on the exported value, we found that this increase in exported value was concentrated in exports to high-income countries and to high-income OECD to high-income OECD countries, and this effect seems to stem from an increase of 28.3% in the value of exports to North American countries. Finally, we found that the trade creation effect was greater for plants that exported less in 2012, previously to the exodus. This finding is consistent with the fact that most Venezuelan migrants found work in the informal sector between 2018, and those plants that are able to hire informal workers are those plants that are smaller. So it seems that the trade creation effect was mostly taken advantage by the plants that were smaller. When we wonder about the mechanisms operating behind the trade creation effect, we found that the Venezuelan exodus has no impact on the overall average wages of plants. However, using an exports dummy in 2012, previously to the exodus, we could tell apart the effect of the Venezuelan migration between non-exporting plants and exporting plants. And we found that a 1 percentage point increase in the share of Venezuelan workers relative to the local labor force decreased by 0.6% the average wages in exporting plants in our sample period. And furthermore, we found that this decrease in wages stems from a decrease in wages in blue-collar workers working in exporting plants. So it seems that the Venezuelan migration might have eased labor costs for exporting plants through a decrease of 0.7% in the average wages in plants that exported before before the exodus. So this ease in labor costs allow firms to skill upgrade their labor input. A 1 percentage point increase in the share of Venezuelan workers increased by 1.2 percentage points the share of higher level degrees white collar worker. More particularly, increase the share of white collar workers in plants in companies with more than a university degree. And this seems to have happened both in non-exporting and in exporting plants. And for blue-collar workers, the Venezuelan migration increased the share of blue-collar workers in exporting plants, in exporting companies, with more than high school with a high school degree relative to workers that have no degree at all, a primary degree or a high school degree by one percentage point. On the other hand, we found a noisy effect on employment. Although we found a decrease in employment that seems to stem from a decrease in employment in exporting plants, we could not tell apart if this effect came from a decrease in employment in white-collar workers or in blue-collar workers. So, consistent with the literature analyzing the labor market effects of the Venezuelan exodus, that found that the effect of the Venezuelan exodus was mostly concentrated on wages and rather than on employment, we found a noisy and negligible effect in employment. Finally, we found that the more labor-intensive the industry in which the firm produced, the greater the effect of the Venezuelan migration on the exported value. So, consistent with the mechanism proposed in our paper, it seems that those plants that had a greater labor intensity, that worked in a more labor-intensive industry, that workers that worked in that plants that were in a more labor-intensive industry could take more advantage of the Venezuelan exodus and export more, and this is consistent with the mechanism proposed, where labor costs would have been eased, and this would have allowed plants to skill upgrade their labor inputs. Finally, we performed some robustness checks and checks to potential threats to identification. We changed our IB with our 7 versions of it. Basically, what we did is to change the way we measure the driving distance. We measure the driving alternatively. We measure the driving distance with Google Maps. Also, we changed the way in the share part of the instrument, and instead of using the share of Venezuelans in each Venezuelan state, we used the share of Colombians in each Venezuelan state to give our IB a slightly different intuition, where networks of Colombians would have been the reason why they would have Venezuelans would have fled to certain Colombian departments. And finally, we used another instrument typically used by the literature, a shift share instrument originally proposed by CART, and all our trade creation results remained unchanged. On the other hand, we excluded the main manufacturing departments so as to test if our results were driven by some of these departments, and all of our results, trade creation results, remain unchanged. We also relaxed the firm's export threshold up to $10,000 of exports each year, and all our trade creation results remain unchanged. And also, our trade creation results hold when collapsing all our variables at the departmental level. On the other hand, our empirical strategy is valid, and our results hold after including a pre-exodus trade control with Venezuela to test if there were a disproportionate impact of the Venezuelan crisis on certain bordering Colombian departments. Our results also hold when including controls for those trading partners that signed free trade agreements within the analyzed period with Colombia. And finally, we tested if the share part of our instrument had parallel trends as suggested by Goldsmith, Pinkham, and co-authors in 2020. And we found that the distant shares to the most populous Venezuelan states, they do not predict higher exports or other firms' outcomes in the years previous to the exodus, thus validating our instrumental variables approach as suggested by this paper I just mentioned. So, to conclude, we found evidence consistent with firms hiring workers that were more compatible with exports to developed nations due to lower labor costs caused by the Venezuelan exodus. And the mechanisms proposed in our paper are new to the literature and reconcile the labor market effect found by other papers with the trade creation effect found in our paper in a context of forced migration. And I hope I have used my time properly, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Carlo. That's a really, really fascinating combination of different data sources there, and very clearly and well explained. Please do put your questions in the chat if you'd like to ask anything to Carlo. I was very interested in the skill upgrading result that you showed, and apologies if this comes from a place of not having understood the details, but you showed a result whereby the proportion was higher of people with higher degrees when there was a higher proportion of migrants, and also that when the proportion of migrants were higher, the labour cost was lower. Were those in different types of firms? And if not, is it possible to show that there's a different people in the sample, i.e. you're not getting higher degrees for a lower labour cost, but rather you've got different groups of people? Or are you able to look at the same individuals contributing to those different effects? Thanks.
Yes. I can explain a little further this result. Yes, firstly, what we did was, I think you understood it properly. On the one hand, we merged the annual manufacturing survey with the other survey, which is called the EDIT, in order to have information about the educational attainment. And although these both surveys are not the same survey, we analyzed the correlation between white-collar workers and skilled workers, and the correlation was practically 1, and also the correlation between blue-collar workers and unskilled workers, and the correlation was practically 1. And so we could analyze. The only thing we could analyze with the data we had is the share of, for example, for blue-collar workers, the share of workers that had a high school degree in relation to all workers, to all blue-collar workers, which are the workers that had no degree at all, that had a primary degree or had a high school degree. So I think that although we could not dig deeper into different types of workers or their particular skills or the tasks they performed at their labor place, I think the evidence is suggestive of the skill upgrading effect. I don't know if I answered properly your question or I.
That's perfect. Thanks. It's good to know about those separate surveys, and I look forward to digging into the detail in the paper. I don't see any other questions coming in on the chat, but if people would like to engage with Carlo and his co-authors on this work, the paper is available on the JDC website.
Okay. So shall I stop sharing?
There was just a question coming in now, Carlo.
Okay.
I see that Paddy lost his connection temporarily, but it's a comment from Dani Bahar. Let me read it.
Yes, let me see. Sorry, Oof. I don't know, using this and or previous migrant. I don't know. Yes, the question of Dani is about the exclusion restriction in the IB, and I think that I read it very quickly, but about the systematical differences that might appear in the in the Colombian bordering departments with Venezuela. Yes, we tested On the one hand, and on our specification, we used the district GDP per capita for the year 2000 interacted with annual dummies to see if there were some systematic differences in Colombian department previously to the exodus, and also on the robustness section, we tested if we included a pre-exodus trade control with Venezuela to test if there were a disproportionate impact in bordering departments, in Colombian bordering departments of the Venezuelan crisis, and if this impact could have affected disproportionately these departments and could have had a differential effect or a biasing effect in our estimates. And all our results, as you can see, we only tested the trade creation effect results, but the total exported value on the export to high income and OECD high income and North American countries remained unchanged. And finally, we also tested here for the Goldsmith-Pinkham critique to Bartik type instruments, and we tested if the share part, which is the share part of the instrument, which is a part that might be correlated with this critique that you say about the IB restriction. We tested if there were parallel trends in the share part for IB before the exodus, and there were no parallel trends, so there seems to be no systematic differences in departments, in Colombian departments that our IB is correlated with. I don't know if I answered your question, but I think that although this question is not answerable, I mean, we did a lot of work to try to avoid this problem.
Thank you, Carlo, for answering that. Paddy, are you back online?
I am. Thank you very much, Charlotte. Apologies, everybody, for dropping off there. I can't see the chat because I just reconnected, but I will suggest that we move on unless there are any other very pressing questions. And if people would like to get in touch with Carlo, there's a copy of the paper is up on the JDC website. Thank you very much indeed, Carlo, for participating in the session. And looking forward to carrying on our engagement.
For the questions.
Thanks. And now we'd like to move on to the presentation of our second paper, which was originally on the schedule as the first one. Welcome to Maria Mayda, who's going to talk to us about refugees and foreign direct investment, quasi-experimental evidence from US resettlements. Maria, thank you very much, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Paddy. Can you hear me well?
Yes, we can, thanks.
Okay. Thank you very much. So today I'm going to present a paper on the impact of refugees on foreign direct investment from the country of destination of refugees to the country of origin of refugees. And I'm going to focus on the United States, and I'm going to focus on refugees resettled to the United States. This is joint work with Chris Parsons, Han Pham, and Pierre-Louis Vézina. Let me start with an anecdote that gives you an intuition about the topic of this paper. Let me tell you about David Tai, who fled by boat Saigon in 1975 after the end of the Vietnam War. And he went to Seattle at age 6, where he witnessed Starbucks' success. Afterwards, as an adult, he established Highlands Coffee in 1998 in Vietnam. This was the first Viet Kieu investment in Vietnam. As of 2009, the company operated 80 coffee shops in 6 cities and provinces across Vietnam. And eventually in 2012, David Tai sold 50% shares to Jollibee for $25 million. So basically what we are doing in this paper is to extend the anecdote that I just told you about by looking at the impact of refugees on FDI flows from the United States, in particular from the commuting zone where refugees were resettled, to refugees' countries of origin. And this is an important channel because foreign direct investment has been found to be very important for growth. Yet, it's an unexplored channel. There is not systematic evidence in the literature about this channel. And our paper contributes by providing evidence both across countries, because we have a data set that covers the universe of refugees resettled in the United States between 1990 and year 2000 from any country in the world. And then I will also show you some results of a case study focusing on Vietnam. So why is foreign direct investment important? Foreign direct investment is an essential ingredient for economic development and for long-lasting stable relationships between origin and destination countries. There's also evidence that technology diffusion that takes place through foreign direct investment contributes to productivity and economic growth even more than domestic investment. And importantly, foreign direct investment is less likely to experience capital reversals. So let me tell you what we do. In the first part of the paper, we use this data set that covers all refugees resettled to the United States between 1990 and 2000. And this is a highly confidential data that we aggregate up to the commuting zone country of origin level. And so we can exploit this variation and we can look at the impact of 1990-2000 refugee inflows on 2005-2015 FDI flows from the US commuting zone where refugees were resettled back to their origin countries. In the second part of the paper, we look at a case study, which is the study of Vietnam right after the Vietnam War. Okay, so let me get into the details of the paper. Let me tell you the most important empirical challenge that we face in this type of study is the fact that refugees within a given destination country can locate according to clearly labor market variables of that location. So there is endogeneity of refugees' location. And what we do in this paper is to develop a clean identification strategy, which is aimed at estimating the causal effect. So in the first part of the paper, we will exploit exogenous variation in the initial placement of refugees by US resettlement agencies, and we focus on the subsample of refugees without US ties. As I will claim later on, these refugees without US ties were quasi-randomly distributed across the United States. Next, we focus on Vietnam, and there we exploit the natural experiment of the quasi-random dispersion of Vietnamese boat people during the first wave of arrival of Vietnamese boat people in 1975. Okay, let me give you a preview of the main results that we find. We do find the refugee inflows to a commuting zone increasingly, significantly increase FDI to their country of origin. We find evidence that a 10% increase in refugees increases outward FDI flows by 0.54%, FDI projects by 0.24%, and FDI jobs by 0.72%. These magnitudes may seem small, but they are actually larger than the magnitudes that have been found in the related literature on the impact of economic migrants on outward FDI flows from destination to origin countries of migrants. We also find that there is substantial heterogeneity across countries of origin in terms of the impact of refugees on FDI flows. We find that the positive impact is even bigger for countries from the former Soviet Union, former Yugoslavia, and Vietnam. And when we go to our case study, looking at the specific case of Vietnam, we confirm these results, and we can also analyze the impact that laws passed by the Vietnamese government had on the effect of refugees on foreign direct investment. there is a large literature which is related to this paper. First, a few papers analyze the channels through which globalization in terms of migration flows, refugees flows, trade and foreign direct investment interacts in all its dimensions. And the channels through which migrants and refugees foster foreign direct investment are quite similar to the channels through which they can affect trade flows. So what the literature has found is that refugees or migrants and foreign direct investment or trade can be either substitutes or complements. So some evidence about substitutability is in the paper by Kugler and Rappaport, as well as in the paper by Glennon. The paper by Glennon finds that H-1B visa restrictions lead to increased foreign affiliate activity by US multinational corporations. But there is also a lot of evidence that refugees and foreign direct investment can be complementary to each other. And this is because FDI flows are highly sensitive to information frictions, and they are also sensitive to the fact that contract enforcement may not be perfect in the destination country. And from that point of view, refugees can help because turns out, based on our analysis, that refugees keep strong ties with family and friends back home. And so they can relax these information frictions and they can help in terms of contract enforcement. And evidence consistent with this complementary relationship between refugees, migrants, and FDI flows is in the paper by Javorvich et al. And Bucarte et al. Both these papers look at the impact of migrants, while what we do in this paper, in our paper, is to look at refugees, which of course are a very different subset of people in the world. Okay, let me start by talking about the data that we use in the first part of the paper. This is very nice data from the US Department of State. So the US Department of State is responsible for first processing refugees prior to their arrival. Next, welcoming them in their initial placement. And what the State Department does is to enter into agreement with various resettlement agencies for reception and placement services. And these resettlement agencies take care of refugees in the first 3 months of refugees' arrival. The data is highly confidential. It is at the individual level, and it is from the RAP system, which is managed by the Bureau of Population, Refugee and Migration. And the data provides information on the year of arrival of refugees, the city and state of placement within the United States, the country of origin, the type of refugee. So I worked on this data when I worked at the US State Department. And this data set covers, importantly, the entire universe of refugees. So there is no sampling error in this data. Let me show you a picture that gives you information about the pattern of refugee arrivals to the United States from different regions in the world. And what we do in this figure is to divide up refugees between those with ties and those without ties. Refugees without ties are those with family and friends in the United States. So resettlement agencies place these refugees close to their family and friends. Refugees without ties don't have family and friends in the United States. So resettlement agencies decide where to locate them. Refugees themselves don't decide where to go. And it is variation in the second portion of refugees that we exploit to estimate the causal effect of refugees. This is a table that shows you information about the main countries of origin of refugees. The top source is Vietnam, followed by Russia, Ukraine, Iraq, Myanmar, and Bosnia and Herzegovina. And this is for the period that we analyzed between 1990 and 2000. Next, we merged the refugee data with FDI data from FDI Markets, which is the research arm of the Financial Times Group. And this is very nice data because it is data at the project level on all individual cross-border greenfield investment projects since 2003. And we can decompose, we can look at this information decomposed into the extensive and intensive margin. So we know the value of FDI flows, we know the number of projects, and we also know the estimated number of jobs created by each project. And importantly, this data focuses on new physical projects or expansion of an existing investment. So this data does not include mergers and acquisitions. They only include investment that lead to a new physical operation. So what we do is to merge the foreign direct investment data with the refugee data, and we aggregate both up to the commuting zone of destination of the refugee and the country of origin of refugees. Let me now talk in more detail about the main empirical challenge that we face, which is endogeneity in the location of refugees within the United States across commuting zones. There are two main threats to identification of a causal effect. The first threat is individual sorting of refugees into commuting zones. The second threat is the fact that resettlement agencies might carry out strategic placement of refugees across commuting zones. So let me start with the first threat. What does sorting at the individual level mean? It means that if refugees are free to choose where they can locate, they're likely to go to locations with strong labor markets, where FDI flows may be already high. So there might be a reverse causality problem. So it might be that it is the fact that FDI flows from a given country of origin or overall are high in a commuting zone that attracts refugees to go there. As I said, though, what we can do is to exploit the differentiation in our data between refugees with and without ties. Refugees without ties do not choose where they live upon arrival. They do not decide where they go when they arrive. Their arrival location is decided by resettlement agencies. So basically, we exploit variation in the location decision of individuals who cannot choose where to locate. And what we do is to exploit variation in the initial placement of refugees without US ties, because we don't want to capture the endogeneity in the decision to relocate by these refugees. Now, you may worry that refugees after their initial placement might move so much that the variation that we exploit in the initial placement may not capture much. But actually, refugees have an incentive to remain in the location where they're placed by the resettlement agency, because otherwise they would lose assistance from the agency. And we calculate that the fraction of refugees without US ties who move to another location within the 3-month period is a small 7.4%. Next, let me talk about strategic placement by resettlement agencies. So once we have addressed the issue that refugees might sort into commuting zones, and by exploiting the variation refugee without ties, we are not concerned about that first part of endogeneity, we now consider the possibility that resettlement agencies might be strategic in their placement of refugees. So resettlement agencies may place refugees in a given location according to the strength of the labor market in that location. And again, according to opportunities in the labor market that might be related to foreign direct investment. So again, there might be a reverse causality problem, there might be an endogeneity problem. So first of all, what we do is to introduce commuting zone fixed effects and country of origin fixed effects, which are standard multilateral resistance terms in a gravity model, which is the model that we will use. The commuting zone fixed effects account for the fact that a given commuting zone might have, in general, a higher propensity, for example, to invest abroad. And country of origin fixed effects control for the fact that a given country of origin, again, may be more likely to receive foreign direct investment from the United States. Next, what we do is to account for the fact that there is one piece of information that resettlement agencies take potentially into account when they decide where to place refugees. And this piece of information is the size of the community of connationals of refugees. So the number of migrants in that commuting zone from the same country of origin of refugees. Resettlement agencies take into account how large this community is, because immigrants from the same country of origin may provide help to refugees who just arrived. And the potential problem in terms of estimating a causal effect is that, again, this variable might cause or might be correlative with foreign direct investment flows, and it might be a related variable that creates a bias in our estimation. So what do we do? What we do is to first control for the number of economic migrants from the same country of origin and in the same commuting zone as refugees. And we do so by also using the measure of ancestry, which was constructed by Cardi et al. Next, what we do is to look at commuting zones where there are no migrants, economic migrants from the same country of origin as refugees. So by looking at this subset of commuting zones, by construction, there cannot be such a related variable bias. And finally, what we do is also to control, not for the stock of economic migrants, which is the size of the community that I was talking about, but for the flow of economic migrants between 1990 and 2000. And the reason we do so is that the number of economic migrants that arrive in the same commuting zone from the same country of origin proxies all those factors that drive workers of a given nationality to go to that commuting zone. So we account for all those commuting zone country of origin specific drivers that might lead a given resettlement agency to place refugees in a given location from a given commuting zone. So we end up estimating a structural gravity model where we regress foreign direct investment flows between 2005 and 2015 on the number of refugees in the same commuting zone from the same country of origin, and we instrument the total number of refugees with refugees without ties. We also apply the inverse hyperbolic sign transformation as opposed to logs to keep zero values. First of all, our first stage of the instrument is quite strong. Let me show you some of the results. So as I was saying, we have a baseline result that we confirm by running robustness checks, where we look only at commuting zones with no migrants in 1990. We also confirm our result when we control for migrant inflows between 1990 and 2000. We also control for the size of the community of connationals in the same commuting zone by using the number of economic migrants or by using the ancestry measure by Bucard et al. In all these results, the baseline result and the robustness checks, what we find is a positive and significant impact of refugees who arrive to the United States from a given country on outward foreign direct investment flows back to the country of origin. By construction, we are looking at an effect that takes place 50 years later. And the reason is that it takes time for refugees to assimilate in the United States, and also conditions back in the country of origin of refugees need time to go back to a normal situation, and so that's why we are looking at these effects with a lag. And actually, we find evidence that the conditions in the origin country of refugees matter. So what we find is that the positive impact of refugees on FDI flows are more positive in countries of origin where the average political stability between 2005 and 2015 is higher. And we, on the other hand, find that the impact of refugees on foreign direct investment flows is smaller and potentially zero in origin countries where there is a lot of political instability. And there is a lot of uncertainty around political conditions. We also run additional regressions where we look at the source countries of refugees one by one, and we find that, as I mentioned at the beginning, that the strongest effects are for countries in the ex-Soviet Union, in former Yugoslavia, and also Vietnam, which is the case study that I turn to next. You told me how much time I have left.
If it's possible to do it in 2 minutes, that would be much appreciated. Thank you.
So in this case study, what we do is to exploit variation in the first wave of Vietnamese refugees right after the Vietnam War. My co-authors, Chris Parsons and Pierre-Louis Vézina, have a companion paper that was published in the Economic Journal where they look at the impact of Vietnamese refugees on trade flows from the United States back to Vietnam. And they make a strong case for the exogeneity of the allocation of the first wave of Vietnamese refugees across the United States. In that paper, they look at the variation across states. In this paper, we look at the variation across community zones. What we do as well is to examine the role of policies aiming to harness overseas diaspora for development of origin countries. And here are some pictures. I'm not going to go through the details of the dispersion policy, but we go through the details in the paper, and what we show is that because of both political reasons and practical reasons, these refugees were quasi-randomly dispersed. This is the variation that we use to instrument for the number of Vietnamese refugees arrivals after 1975 until 1994. And what we find, which you can show in this, you can see in this figure, is that refugee arrivals from Vietnam between 1975 and 1994 had a positive impact on FDI outflows to South Vietnam, where we also find evidence of a diversion effect. So we find evidence of actually a negative effect on North Vietnam. And finally, we also find the laws passed by the Vietnamese government in 2005 and 2008 have a positive impact, and this positive impact is larger, the larger is the number of refugees. So these figures show you the positive impact of these laws, which becomes bigger the higher is the number of refugees from a given in a given community zone. So this concludes my presentation. Thank you very much, and I'm going to stop sharing.
Thank you very much indeed for presenting such a great overview, and especially appreciate you going through that case study fast at the end there. There's a question in the chat about the first part of the presentation relating to how the ties are demonstrated and whether this is based on answers by the refugees or whether they're validated through another data source. Thanks.
So we use data at the individual level where refugees provide information on whether they have family and friends or not. Of course, they have an incentive to give that information, because to the extent that they give that information, the resettlement agencies will place them close to family and friends. On the other hand, if they don't declare any connections in the United States, they are placed by resettlement agencies and they lose contact. They are not able to locate close to their family and friends.
Great. Thank you very much for that answer. A follow-up question in the chat, which is, could they declare fake connections to influence that location?
So they potentially could. At the same time, it is true that refugees that are resettled in the United States go through a very stringent vetting process, a security clearance. And if you have ever done a security clearance to work in the US government, which is similar to the security clearance that is done by refugees, you know that they will ask for a lot of information and they will check that information. So it is really hard for refugees to lie on this type of information because they have to undergo a lot of screening and a lot of questions. And of course, they risk not getting the refugee status if they lie.
Great, thank you very much. That's all very clear, much appreciated. And if anyone would like to engage further with Anna Maria, there's a version of the paper on the JDC website. Anna Maria, thank you very much indeed for joining us, and I hope you continue to engage with us on this work.
Thank you.
And now we're going to move on to the final paper of this session on the impact of forced displacement. And I'd like to invite Anna Maria Tribin to talk to us about immigration and violent crime, evidence for the Colombia-Venezuela border. Over to you, Anna Maria. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, can you see the presentation?
Yes, thanks.
Okay, perfect. So, hi, my name is Ana Maria Tribin. I want to talk about my work with Brian Knight on immigration and crime. This paper investigates the link between violent crime and immigration using data from Colombian municipalities during the recent episode of immigration from Venezuela. There is a long history of xenophobia and fear of immigrants around the world. This paper tries to debunk myths about association between migration and crime before and after a massive migration wave such the one from Venezuela. We want to understand what is really happening and find out if there is evidence for this association. In Colombia, this wave has led to anti-migrant perceptions and a backlash among natives. For example, a national survey found that 62% of respondents had a negative perception of Venezuelan migrants, and 54% of respondents were in favor of closing the border. Moreover, an Oxfam survey shows that 74% of Colombians believe that immigration increases crime and insecurity. Sorry. So in this paper, we systematically address these issues using data on crimes in Colombian municipalities. We want to answer two specific research questions. The first one is, has the recent immigration wave from Venezuela led to an increase in violent crime in affected regions in Colombia? And if so, if this increase primarily involved crimes against natives or crimes against migrants? While xenophobia around criminal activity involves perception of more crimes committed by immigrants against natives, there is evidence that immigrants themselves are at a bigger risk for victimization. The existing literature on immigration and crime has lacked the nationality data necessary to understand which of these views are correct. So we want to know do increases in crimes in areas with more migrants primarily involve crimes committed against natives or crimes committed against migrants? To answer these two questions, we use multi-panel data on homicides in Colombian municipalities between 2010 and 2019. This data includes information of the nationality of the victim. For this analysis, we exploit both the temporal and geographic variation. I will explain this deeper in a few slides, but the temporal variation involves a shock that triggers mass migration, and geographic variation is the distance from the frontier. So let me talk a bit about the context. Venezuela has experienced an economic and political crisis during the past decade, and especially so during the time period following the death of President Hugo Chavez, which occurred in 2013. Chavez was replaced by his vice president, Nicolás Maduro. The presidency of Nicolás Maduro has been characterized by political and economic turmoil. Declines in oil prices, among other factors, contributed towards an economic depression and periods of hyperinflation. One of the key moments in the relation between Venezuela and Colombia is the closing of the border with Colombia by Maduro in August 2015, that was then reopened in August 2016. This event led to a massive migration wave that was accelerated in 2017 and peaked in 2018. The Colombian government has managed this challenging situation by providing timely border assistance, relaxing entry requirements, granting temporary permits, and ensuring universal emergency care. By the end of 2019, an estimate of 4 million Venezuelans had left the country, with nearly half settling in Colombia. As I mentioned, we exploit both temporary and geographic variation. Our temporal variation involves the closing of the frontier in August 2015 and the subsequent reopening in August 2016. The geographic variation involves comparing municipality closer to and further from 5 key border crossing points along the border between Colombia and Venezuela. Let's talk about the temporal variation. As shown in this figure, the closing from 2015 to 2016 led to a substantial decline in the border crossing over this period. You can see it here in the graph. Relative to the prior years from 2012 to mid-2015. Likewise, there was a large increase, a big jump the next years after the reopening of 2016. So we can see that we have this peak in 2018. With roughly 100,000 crossings per month at this peak here. So these spikes coincide with the economic turmoil as represented by hyperinflation. This is a graph of inflation, and we can see that according to official government, figures, also, we have a peak in inflation between 2018 and the beginning of 2019. Regarding the geographic variation, Colombia and Venezuela share a land border of nearly 1,400 miles, and we focus our research on the location of the 5 key border crossing points. This is a picture of the massive migration in one of the crossing points, that is Cucuta. In this figure, we have data of migration through each crossing point during official, using this official border crossing data. As you can see, Cucuta is the location with the most crossing. And the picture was from this point. It is located on the Simón Bolívar International Bridge, which links the key highways originating in Caracas, the largest city in Venezuela, to the key highways that ultimately led to Bogotá, the largest city in Colombia. And Maicao here is the location with the second most crossings. Here, this map plots the deciles of the percentage point change in the fraction born in Venezuela between 2005 and 2018, using the census that are available. Overall, there is an increase in the fraction of the population that was born in Venezuela. The largest increase are clustered near the land border with Venezuela, with especially large increases in the areas close to the 5 key border crossings that are these points in blue. You can see that here we have a bigger increase in the population from Venezuela. So for this analysis, we estimate the following regression. Here, H represents the homicide rate in municipality M during the month T. We focus on homicides because it is a measure that does not suffer from self-reporting problem and is not subject to important changes in methodology in crime reporting that occur over the past few years. We have time fixed effects and municipality fixed effects. After here indicates the time period following the reopening of the border in August 2016. The natural log of distance represents the travel distance between the municipality and the closest border crossing. So we hypothesize that beta here is going to be negative. This is more homicides after the mass migration near the frontier. So we are working now in a new version using closeness to the entry points instead of the distance to make it more straightforward. Or here we have the results. And as shown in column 1 of this table, we find the hypothesized negative coefficient on the interaction between distance and the indicator for the time period following the reopening of the border. And this relationship is statistically significant. That is, municipalities close to the border experience an increase in crime relative to municipalities further from the border, following the reopening of the border relative to the prior period. To make it shorter, is more homicides near the frontier after the influx of immigrants. Then we decompose the change in homicide rate according to the nationality of the victim. So as shown, while there's a negative coefficient for Colombian victims, it is not significant. Well, we can see a negative sign in the interaction term for Venezuelan victims, and is significant. This negative sign of the interaction for Venezuelan victims is not surprising, given that the large increase in the sheer number of Venezuelans living close to the border. But it represents almost 1/2 of the total result. So we think it's a big magnitude. There is no effect for victims from other countries, and we also find a negative and statistically significant coefficient for victims whom the police did not record a nationality. We don't have formal evidence on this point, but we think that many of these victims with missing nationality lack identification cards, and maybe they were undocumented migrants from Venezuela. For this measure of the rate of homicides, we use the total population in the municipality as the denominator. But in a new version, we are included the number of Venezuelans for the Venezuelan victims and the number of Colombians instead of the total population to measure the homicide rate for Colombians and Venezuela. And we have similar results. So this figure displays the key coefficients and the corresponding confidence intervals. And here for the total victims, there are no statistically significant changes in the roll of distance during the time period from 2011 to 2016 relative to the baseline year, that is 2010. We have a negative and statistically significant effect that start to emerge in 2017, that is the first full year following the reopening of the border in August 2016. The documented negative relationship between distance and the homicide rate is the strongest in 2018, where the migration was at its highest peak. In summary, the timing of the change in the homicides rates corresponds to the timing of the border opening and subsequent arrival of migrants from Venezuela. When focusing on Colombian victims, as we shown here, there is no evidence of a statistical significant relationship between the distance and homicide rates relative to the baseline year of 2010. And in this case, for all the years, both before and after the closing of the border, 2016, we don't see any effect. Therefore, documented relationship between distance and homicide rates are not driven by Colombian victims. When looking at the results of homicides for victims from Venezuela, we documented a lack of pre-trends prior to 2016, but a strong relationship between distance and homicide rates beginning in the year after the border reopened. And again, peaking in 2018, here, the year with the most migrants arriving from Venezuela. So it seems that crime increased with migration, but the victims are the migrants. While our baseline measure of geography assumes a linear relationship between the homicide rate and log distance, we next investigate more fully the geographic pattern underlying these results. In particular, we estimate a regression model in which the effects of the border reopening in August 2016 are measured separated for 100-mile distance bins. So we have all these bins, these 8 bins. So as shown here, the only positive and statistically significant increase in the homicides following the reopening of the border in August 2016 is for the municipalities very close to the border, those within 100 miles. This is consistent with the documented strong clustering of migrants very close to the 5 border crossing points between Venezuela and Colombia. Here we show the same thing for Colombian victims, and we can see that the Colombian victims do not drive the relationship between the distance to the frontier, the opening of the border, and homicides. Now, for Venezuelan victims, by contrast, there is a very sharp increase in homicides close to the border. So we have this effect here in the first bin, that is 100. 100-mile distance here. So our baseline temporal measure is based upon an indicator of the reopening of the border in August 2016. But one could think that the trigger of the diaspora was the economic turmoil. So we next developed an alternative measure based on the inflation rate in Venezuela. As we saw earlier, the month-by-month inflation rises during this period and peak in 2008 and early 2019. So as shown in the table, the results are similar to those using the opening of the frontier. Other robustness check that we carry on was for the fact that the number of crossings in the official data are driven in part by the two key border crossing points, Maicao and Cucuta. So we decided just to use Maicao and Cucuta in this regression, and we only have the minimum distance to one of either of these. And we also have consistent results. The other robustness check is based on a measure of travel times rather than travel distance, and is also consistent with our results. Sorry. Finally, to better understand how these homicide cases are resolved by authorities, we next analyze data on geographic and temporal pattern of arrest for homicides. These data do not include information on the nationality of the victim, but do include information on the nationality of the individual arrested for the crime. And here we don't have any missing nationalities for this data. While we cannot directly link these arrest incidence data to the crime incidence data, we do aggregate them in a similar manner at the level of municipality and month. Here we can see the results for the using the arrest data, and we find no statistical significant change in the relationship between distance and arrest rates following the reopening of the border in August 2016. And we find evidence of an increase in arrests of Venezuelans close to the border, but the magnitude is not the magnitude we were expecting. So not that we were expecting a magnitude that could explain all the homicides. So the results on homicides and arrests for homicides suggest that these homicides close to the border have occurred without a corresponding increase in arrests, suggesting that some of these crimes go unsolved. So, summarizing our empirical analysis documents an increase in homicides in Colombia in the municipalities close to the Venezuelan border, following the closing and then the reopening of the border. Important, these homicides are driven by crimes against Venezuelans, migrants, rather than Colombian natives. We find not corresponding increase in arrests for homicides. While we lack definitive evidence in the exact mechanism underlying the results, we found some possible contributing factors. So I'm going to mention some of them. First, the route from Venezuela to Colombia often involves passing through dangerous territory, making migrants more likely to interact with violent actors. The second is that the irregular situation of migrants means that they disproportionately work high-risk jobs and might therefore be more exposed to violence. The increase in migration among the undocumented makes them more vulnerable to exploitation, extortion, trafficking, sexual abuse, and violence. The third one is that the competition among migrants for jobs in the informal sector can exacerbate economic motivated violence. And finally, the rapid diaspora has exacerbated xenophobic perceptions about migrants, potentially leading to an increase in violence by natives against migrants. We are currently exploring some of these mechanisms. So in our next version, we will have some idea that what is happening behind all this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed for that very clear presentation. There are a few messages in the chat. Anna Maria has asked a couple, but isn't able to come onto microphone now, so I'll just relay them. The first one is about the hypothesized direction of the effect, about the relationship between immigrants and crime being ambiguous. So you were talking about the sign on your parameters of your models. You expect it to be negative when you were looking at your effects. And it's just a question about why the expectation is in that direction. Thanks.
Well, because they're thinking about this association and this perception that the crime increases with migration. If it could go either way, but if that is true, it's supposed to be higher higher rates of homicides near the frontier and after the mass migration. So let me re-say that, to reframe that. We were expecting that because the perceptions, but we were exploring whether that was true or not. And that was true, but we found something interesting and different from also the perceptions that there's a lot of noise thinking about migrants as crime, as the ones that committed crimes, and natives are the victims. And here we cannot say anything about the people that commit crimes, but we can say that the victims are the migrants. So maybe the countries had to take a special attention to this group of people that are very vulnerable.
Thank you. Much appreciated. And there was an additional part of the question, which was something that I also wondered about when you were talking about there being no evidence of an increase in arrests, is whether there's any information about the perpetrators of the crimes and their nationality.
We have nationality of the people that is arrested, but we don't have nationality of the victim. So we cannot match the data, but we can analyze separately arrest. And we were expecting to find any answers there about the increase in homicides, especially those homicides with Venezuelan victims. But from what we got, it seems that a lot of these homicides are not resolved by the authorities.
Great. Thank you very much. There's a technical question in the chat from Carlo. Carlo, I wonder if you could come in and ask that directly, because I'm not sure I'll represent it as accurately as you could. Thanks.
I was wondering if there were a difference before and after the regularization program of 2018 in Colombia, because I think that if there is a difference, that could help you disentangle the mechanism operating behind the increasing crime. Because I think that the increasing crime could come from the forced nature of the migration episode and from the informality faced by Venezuelans before the regularization program. I'm talking about the special permit of permanence, the PEP.
Carlo, we are also exploring the relation with this regularization program, but also during this time there were few permits. Like if you look at the data about migrants, there's a lot of migrants that are undocumented during this time. Like the majority of migrants were undocumented.
Great, thank you very much. And we have time for one more question, which I'll pull out of the chat from Olivia, who asks whether you can distinguish between Venezuelans who come with the intention to migrate and those who are pendulares and cross back and forth between the two countries without the intention to stay. Thanks.
The data we have about Venezuelans in Colombia are from the census, so those are people that live in Colombia. But because our regulation has depends on the distance and the change of time, I guess all that migration is also included there. The pendular migration has been also increasing during this period.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing your work with us. And if anyone would like to continue to engage, the paper is available on the JDC website. Thanks again, Anna Maria.
Thank you.
Just before we close this session, I'd like to thank all of the speakers again and make a couple of small announcements. First of all, please do fill in the survey and answer the poll question that Bjorn mentioned at the beginning. Agnes will very kindly put the links in the chat again. And I'd also like to make an announcement about a side conversation with a keynote speaker, Ted Miguel, later today. At 1:15 Eastern Time or 7:15 Central European Time, Oxfam Professor Ted Miguel will give a keynote on tracking refugee life outcomes, an initial view from the Syrian Refugee Life Study. And Ted's kindly offered to participate in a side conversation, both 30 minutes before and 30 minutes after his intervention. And if you come along to these, you'll be able to engage directly with Ted and ask any questions you may have. You can find the connection details in the email that was shared with you in advance. And we'll post it in the chat during the day. So many thanks again to all of you for your attention, for listening, for your questions, and to our speakers for their contributions. We'll now take a short break before going on to session 4 next. All the best and thanks.
Thank you.